Hello, and welcome to a new review here at Wayward Wine. Usually we discuss drinks that are grape-based. Wines, sherries, ports, but it's winter outside, it's cold, it's nasty, it's freezing, and so I'm turning to my second love, the brown stuff. Yep, whiskey. And where better to start than with our founding father here in America, George Washington. My wife and I were lucky enough to take a trip a few years back to his estate in Mount Vernon, Virginia, which overlooks the river there, and is a beautiful place. Lovely, humble, yet sort of, stately rooms that are really well appointed. Beautiful dining areas, lovely little bedrooms, a gorgeous veranda with a beautiful view. But what you really get a sense as you walk around the grounds is that this man, both before the war and during his presidency and after, was obsessed with agriculture. The gardens there that provided food for the kitchens were massive and quite developed, but in addition to that, there were huge fields of grain and a large, massive staff of slave labor as well. In addition to animal husbandry, meat production, I mean, you named it, he had his hand kind of in every pie that he could. Now, there's a really fantastic reconstructed grist mill about 2.7 miles that you can take this adorable little shuttle to, which we did. And the grist mill itself helped during the 1770s, founded and built around 1771, to process all of the barley, all of the rye, and all of the corn that was being grown on his massive estates. I mean, upwards of 5,000 to 8,000 pounds of flour to be processed by this thing. It's huge, large turning wheels made of wood, cogs, and various other things that I don't understand that help to turn grain into flour. And he sold it at quite a high price and was quite successful at that. But Washington, by the time of his retirement from the presidency in 1797, he was looking to retire. He was in his
mid-60s.
He wanted to simplify the estate. He didn't want it to be so intensely agriculture focused. And on the advice of his land manager, James Anderson, who just happened to be a Scot with some distilling experience making whiskey, he convinced Washington to start building a distillery on site to turn that grain into magical, beautiful whiskey. Now, this happened around 97 when they started building the distillery, and by 1799, it was producing over 11,000 gallons of whiskey in barrel. Probably the largest in all of Virginia, if not the U.S., possibly as well, at the time. Even in Virginia, you had at least around 3,600 certified distilleries by the 18 teens. Some small, some not, but Washington's was definitely one of the largest at the time, taking advantage of this grist mill that could just produce fantastic flour consistently throughout the year. Now, they built quite a large distillery. It had multiple copper pot stills, wooden barrels for fermenting in, and all of it was driven by fire. This was an age where you didn't have electricity, you didn't really have modern temperature control, or even really reliable thermometers for that matter to some extent. And so you really had to do it by touch, by feel, by smell, and by fire. And that's what drove a lot of production there. Also, in addition to James Anderson running the distillery, there were 6 skilled slaves who were included in the production of it that helped to make it happen. And these included Hanson, Peter, Nat, Daniel, James, and Timothy. Just worth mentioning because no winery, no distillery, no beverage production happens without everyone from the cellar rats all the way through to the assistant managers to the manager itself. We give a lot of credit to people that are at the head of the winery or who own it, Washington in this instance, but honestly, it's the hands that make it happen. Because in this case, especially so, because managing a distillery with such ancient technology it takes a lot of intuition and a lot of experience. And they made, in addition to whiskeys there, they made apple brandies, pear brandies, persimmon brandies, which I'd love to try someday, but we'll see if they start experimenting with that. So in 1997, a big archaeological excavation happened in and around Mount Vernon, and they found all the water flows, the chutes, the canals that had been created there to help power the mill. They rebuilt it. in addition to the distillery itself, where they found pieces of the stills, pieces of the barrels, and various tools and things involved in the distilling process, as well as buttons and things that people had lost over the time. And they used all of that, including the layout of the grounds that they discovered, to rebuild this distillery from scratch using traditional methods, wood, handcrafted nails, everything from scratch, hand-carved, hand-cut stone for the walls. I mean, everything was done as close to as it had been before. And the whiskey itself today is made the same way, using only wood fire, using really a great sense of experience, using water locally, using locally sourced grains as well. And those grains include the original recipe that Washington had created for his straight rye whiskey, which was 60% rye, 35% corn, and about 5% malted barley. And that was the base for the straight rye whiskey that they made. Rye was an easily available grain. It wasn't used commonly for making bread, and it was far easier to grow during hard harvest seasons and could produce a lot more grain than barley, which tended to be turned into bread and pastry and that sort of thing. So usually was reserved for that. So predominantly rye is the basis for this whiskey. And to show you the bottle that I picked up when we were there is Washington himself. And yep, this is his straight rye whiskey. This was produced in 2016, and this is bottle number 1063. 375 milliliter bottle, half bottle, split. And it just, has lots of nice information, a picture of the grist mill and distillery, and yeah, nice little label from Virginia. So let's try it. Now this is straight, so it hasn't been blended back. It is 43% proof, or 43% alcohol, roughly 80% proof. And as you can see, it has a beautiful, clear, crystalline amber color to it. I mean, this is pretty stuff with a almost sort of honeyed lemon highlight to it. Yeah, so this has definitely gone through some nice process. The legs are quite filigreed, quite pretty as well. Aromatically, it tastes like rye bread. If you've ever had rye bread, it's got that lovely peppery quality to it almost. I get notes of red cedar, caramelized coconut from the whiskey barrels. These are aged in bourbon barrels for 2 years in this case, to kind of mimic how his spirit would be transported around in barrels and get that kind of complexity from those barrels as it was being shipped around. Because he didn't ship in bottles back then. The glass was too poor to really do, and tradition was just ship a barrel. But yeah, aromatically, moderate plus intensity here. Lots of nice caramelized coconut there. I get a slight dried strawberry note. Just pretty white ash, white pepper, and lovely, like honey, but like wax, dried honey. Caramelized pear is a certain note here. You definitely get a lot of this lovely toffee caramel thing going on, but with that nice savory note of that pepper, that rye bread note coming through, and a slight almost like corn-like sweetness to it. Cooked corn, certainly. This is all like lovely process that you're getting here from the wood fire that they're using. On the palate, it starts off really supple, really smooth, really soft, really round, almost deceptively pretty. I'd say it has this that strawberry notes there again. The honey's up front. That coconut, that's like fresh coconut shavings, in addition to caramel drizzle on top of that. But that fruit's up front. And then slowly but surely, that heat comes from the alcohol. Its viscosity starts to turn to heat, turn to coal fire. You get a lot more of those toasty notes coming through, the caramelized pear, the ash, the white pepper, and yet there's still that lovely grain going through the core of this. Extremely viscous, has a nice weight to it, a nice thick fattiness to it almost, but dry and quite serious on the finish. Tannic as well, both wood tannin, nice kind of dried cedar, and yeah, that kind of bourbon barrel note, that coconut, that toasted coconut comes through, and the tannins, but still remaining fairly smooth and fairly viscous. That honey note's persistent throughout as well, and the finish is quite long. This is really fantastic. It's spiced, peppery, herbaceous, grainy, and yet has this lovely honey and, again, that red fruit, that strawberry fruit quality to it that I find quite alluring. So it's, a bit steep. You can find a bottle of this at the gift shop for 180, 188. And it's only a half bottle, but it will last you when you open it. I mean, I've had this for a few years, and it's just holding up beautifully. And a great example of what experimental archaeology can do in recreating not only a building, but also practices as well, and a product that was in its own self fairly short-lived. I mean, Washington only lived more or less 3 years after the distillery was being built, and after that, it more or less went into disrepair and then was dismantled. So to get a chance to kind of recreate the past as close as we can with methods that we are pretty sure happened back then based on his notes and James Anderson's notes, that we get as close as we can to kind of what things could have been like back then. And honestly, a good product, something that stands up really nicely. I would drink this, I would drink it straight, maybe with a little water. Ice would probably knock out all those really cool complex notes, so I'd avoid tossing any ice cubes in there. But you could have some fun with some sort of sweet simple syrup maybe to play with, just to kind of balance out that hot coal-like fire that's there and kind of tame the tannins down as well. Play around with cocktails. Anything you do with whiskey might be a little fun. But yeah, really interesting example of what could have happened over 200 years ago in Mount Vernon in Virginia by our founding father, George Washington. So thank you for watching, and definitely give something cool like this a try. It's pretty special.